Sengupta at the far end, on your right, is Associate Director of Tax and Trade and Regulatory Affairs at Diageo. Sitting next to him is Mark Johnson, who's National Customs and Trade Control Director at Kuehne+Nagel. And sitting next to me is Patrick Keating, who's European Government Affairs Manager at Honda Motor Europe. Gentlemen, in that sequence, if you'd just like to introduce yourselves, land the role of your business playing in this debate, and your observations, please, about how you're preparing for Brexit.
Sure. Hello, everyone. So, for those who don't know, Diageo deals in alcohol. So our main products are spirits, and there's also spirits like Smirnoff, Scotch, there's Gordon's, Tanqueray, and also beer in Guinness. In terms of what's been going on for the last 2 years, I think we have been pretty prepared, and we've done a lot of work over this, and part of that has been led by the governance side of things. So very early on, we set up a Brexit working group, which was headed by our head of investor relations, and has a multifunction element in it, represented by legal, HR, supply, tax, etc. And there's lots of sub-working groups below it working on specific issues. But the truth is, this is very unprecedented. So there's been a lot of making it up as we go along, to a certain extent. But to start with, we had to determine what were the main consequences. And we've always worked on a worst-case scenario. The worst-case scenario being March 2019, that we have no deal and we're out. And for a business like us, to just illustrate what the main issues are, is that we have 3 production sites in the EU. Current EU. So the main one is obviously Scotland, where we make all our Scotch whisky. Then there's Ireland, where we make all our Guinness, and Northern Ireland, which is involved in the Bailey's production, and in Italy, where we make a number of different spirits. We're actually quite lucky because spirits don't attract any tariffs into the EU. Generally, it doesn't attract tariffs into the EU. Except from today, bourbon attracts 25% tariffs from the EU for many other reasons that we won't go into. So in terms of our intra-EU trade, in terms of cost, we shouldn't have that much cost on tariffs, at least. However, there are obviously other major consequences. So if we had to prioritize the top 2 consequences, we currently utilize free trade agreements around the world, which is obviously a very big number for us. And whilst there are positive noises on that continuing and more being entered into, we're not clear what will happen to that. And the second big consequence is really procurement, because obviously on a lot of our procurement materials, a lot of it coming from the EU, we will attract tariffs. So that's at least on a cost basis of what's going to affect us. And one example to illustrate there on the procurement side of things is that, as I mentioned earlier, Bailey's is made in the island of Ireland. So it uses cream from the island of Ireland. And we have a very integrated supply chain between Republic and Northern Ireland, where liquid and goods move in between. And cream/dairy has a high tariff rate, and how we're going to resolve that, and it moves freely between Ireland and Northern Ireland, is going to cost us a lot of money. So going forward, where are we? Whilst I say we've been working on a worst-case scenario, we're obviously coming at a very, very crux period, because if there really is no deal in March 2019, we need to start doing things now or yesterday. And that comes in a supply perspective where we obviously need to procure glass, which takes time. We have to have an unprecedented supply, 24/7 production, overtime, warehouses, freight, logistics, etc. And whilst we've been planning for everything, the honest truth is we've not pushed the button on anything, because we're still waiting like everybody else. And the transition deal or being announced in March has definitely put a certain stop to what we're doing. And that's been one of the big challenges as well, because everybody working on this, whilst we have senior stakeholders involved, it's on top of their day jobs. And I think especially in supply, for example, for March. It's like, oh, well, nothing's going to happen in 2019, so we don't have to do anything. So that's been one of our big challenges. So we really need to kind of make a decision soon on how we pull forward supply or what we do. And the reason probably we're obviously delaying the decision is it costs money, and we may be spending money which we don't need in the end. So that's why we're in a bit of an interesting position at the moment.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Dilip. Sitting in the middle is Mark, often as Kuehne+Nagel is in the supply chain. Mark, so how are you approaching the...
Yeah, so as an organisation, we're obviously a global logistics player, 74,000 employees in 1,300 locations in 100 countries around the world. And, you know, the volumes that we deal with are in excess of 4 million TEUs, 1.6 million tonnes of air freight, and surprisingly 18.4 million overland movements, which isn't just a European, but as a global organisation. So we have 14,000 employees in the UK, and when James asked me to come and speak here, I sort of thought, okay, what am I going to say? And I was fortunate to be invited to the House of Commons in October by Charlie Affleck on a Be Ready at Day One panel discussion. And I went back and looked at my notes and I thought, okay, so what have we done since October to now? And my opening gambit there was the real concern for industry is around the uncertainty and not knowing what we're going to do. So as an industry, our industry, as mentioned, is really resilient. If only we know what to do, we'll go off and do it. And actually, UK PLC is really resilient and it will do what it needs to do. So that uncertainty is all around what's required, when is that requirement going to be needed, how are we going to do it, and perhaps more importantly is where we're going to do it. Because we just heard from the Port of Dover, it simply can't happen at the Port of Dover. Well, it can for one day, and then we'll be shutting the doors. So the Minister referenced the implementation period. It disturbs me because the implementation period seems to be, well, that's okay, we now got until December 20. We should not forget, whilst in principle the implementation has been agreed, it has not been signed and ratified. There's two big issues, the European Court of Justice and more importantly the Irish border, that has to be resolved. And we have two opportunities to do that. One is June the 28th, that's next week, and I certainly haven't heard anything that gives us a solution around the Irish border. And the other day is the next time the European Council sits, which is in October. That's it. If we don't have a deal in October, we're March 29 next year. Okay, are we ready?
Thank you, excellent. And Patrick, as a major motor manufacturer approaching this from the UK.
Yeah, well, let me just start by echoing what Mark just said about transition or implementation period, and that ties into our contingency planning. Transition or implementation does give you some positivity that negotiations are heading in the right direction, but as Mark just referenced, it's not signed, sealed, delivered and ratified. The parliaments on both sides of the channel still have to play a role. The member states have to play a role. So that means we don't have that legal certainty that transition will be delivered, which means what do we have to contingency plan to? As Dip was saying, the UK becoming a third country as of March. That's the only point of certainty that we in fact have. Just a few words about Honda in Europe. We employ 8,000 people across the continent. We have 6 manufacturing plants, so our large car plant in Swindon, where we're building about 160,000 units a year. But we also have motorcycle factories in Spain and Italy, a power equipment factory in France, which is making lawnmowers, generators, marine engines, basically anything that's got a Honda engine in it that doesn't move by itself. And then a small car factory in Turkey, which is mostly supplying the local market, but which uses engines built and delivered from Swindon. So the further complication is how do we ensure we replicate smooth flow not only to Europe, but to Turkey, which enjoys a customs union with the EU. In terms of our approach to Brexit, we have, for almost 2 years now, have created a central Brexit working group coordinated by an external consultancy who brings some project management skills to bear. The first step in that process was to work with all the different business units, because we're a fairly complex group of companies within Europe. So you have the manufacturing sites, you have Honda Motor Europe, which is the sales and marketing arm, you have a logistics function, you have an accessories and spare parts function, R&D, human resources, IT, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about bringing those people together and listing out what were all the potential risks of the UK becoming a third country. That list extended to some 200-odd different lines in a spreadsheet, but really you can boil it down to 4 areas. One, I think, as was referenced earlier, is people. At the factory, some 20% of our workforce are European nationals working on the line, building the products, but equally at our European head office in Bracknell, where I'm based, 20% or thereabouts of our workforce are Europeans as well, because we're trying to run a European business, selling cars and other products into European markets. So having clarity on how, one, we're able to bring workers into the UK, also to support our logistics function. I think at our Swindon warehouse, some 50% of the workforce are EU nationals. But also, how do we move people from the UK across our operations in Europe? So people is one thing. Tariffs are another issue. Obviously, if we start trading on WTO terms, tariffs come into apply, and in the automotive sector on finished cars, that's a 10% rate, and on parts it's 4.5%. Our hope and our aspiration is tariffs do not come into play, but they still have to be accounted for in some way. Regulatory divergence is another issue. We operate in the European market on the basis of a single regulatory regime. So as the Minister referenced earlier, for us, type approval is a big issue. We can sell a car across the single market on the basis of one set of tests. Outside of the EU, how is that going to work? The Commission has been very clear in its guidance. The UK, perhaps, there's a gap in our understanding on how that's going to work going forwards. But you have other things like REACH compliance, CO2 regulation, the whole host of standards which come into play. And will the border be the point at which the compliance with those standards is checked? And how will that add friction to the border? And then really the topic of today, and probably what's keeping our factory management awake at night, is what happens at the border and what friction is there. You'll have heard just-in-time referenced at several points today. Just to sort of bring that into an example for you, some 40% of the components we use to build cars at Swindon are sourced from suppliers in the EU. That equates to some 350 trucks a day crossing the border, whether coming directly to the factory or to our suppliers who then supply to ourselves, or roughly 2 million parts a day. We hold an hour's worth of stock line side and a further day's worth of stock in local warehousing. So any disruption, friction at the border creates some serious potential for disruption to our highly efficient just-in-time operations. And a lot of the contingency planning we're doing is thinking about what does that look like? What are the delays that we can consider? So we hear from Port of Dover, maybe that's 15 minutes. But if you look at trade flows with third countries, that can extend to days. So really, we have some ideas in mind and things that we're looking at, but you can't really press the button or do the math properly until we have a bit more certainty about where we go. And I think that will bring me nicely to an end.
that word certainty again. Thank you, gentlemen. Listen, I know I promised a panel session. I've got loads of questions I'd like to ask, but I'm really keen to hear if there's any questions from our delegates and any observations or comments. And let's hear how some of you are planning it as well. Do I have any takers? We've got 2 microphones at the back of the room. And if you haven't got any questions right at the moment, I'm going to start on my list. So don't let me down now, guys. Come on, we need to make this interactive. So what are the big assumptions that we're making then? Because clearly, in the vacuum that we're trying to actually do this planning, and it's very serious planning, it's not something that can just be put together at short notice. What are the kind of assumptions you're making in your scenario planning and the contingency arrangements that you're making? Do you want to pick that up, Patrick?
Yeah, so I think the assumption we have to work to is the UK becomes a third country as of March, and at some point down the road, either at that point or after transitional period, it leaves the customs union. That implies certain logical consequences, so there will be an increased amount of documentation to deal with, so we have to plan for how do we upgrade systems or add resource to deal with that? And then we can make an assumption that there will be certain points of friction at the border around regulation and regulatory controls. So I think we're working the assumption there will be friction. And what we need to find out is what that friction will look like and how do we then mitigate against it.
And to Dilip as well as another shipper, are you looking to do that in-house, or would you be looking to businesses like Kuehne+Nagel and Siva and others to take that off from you?
So at the moment, most of the things we've done is in-house. We have been speaking to a number of suppliers about how they're planning to do their pieces. On the logistics side of things, we're still waiting for more clarity really on how this will work. Because, but invariably we'll need support on all our logistics requirements. So.
Okay. You're clearly expecting a little bit of an upturn, did I say, Mark, in some demand and requirements from your clients, and how are you approaching that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, no different than John referenced. You know, we live in a different world now. There isn't the knowledge and experience that sits out that used to be there in a pre-1193. So we, right from the off, as far as the referendum was concerned, we set up, similar to my gentleman on the panel here, a working group. And one of the key areas was looking around how are we going to manage just our own business and the declaration requirements in a hard Brexit, post-Brexit world. We currently complete somewhere in the region of around 250,000 declarations per annum for our third country requirements, with about 60 FTA. So we did some scenario mapping as part of the Brexit working group. And just our own European business, that's without any other organisations coming to us who haven't traded in a third country environment. We scenario mapped, and we will add just our own organisation somewhere in the tune of 1 million extra declarations. So we will not go 250, 60 FTE, 1.25. One, because there isn't the knowledge and experience out there. Two, because that just isn't going to work. So we've looked around technology, and we've also looked at our service centre. So again, in our organisation, we're fortunate. We have low-level service centres that sit in Belgrade and Thessalonica. But, you know, John referenced that there isn't that technological solution in there to complete a customs declaration from start to finish without any manual intervention. It needs manual intervention. Even in our own organisation, where we offer one global operating system, today we went through the exercise, fortunately from 2016, where we looked at what gets loaded into our operating system and what information we can draw out of that without any manual intervention to pre-populate the customs system or the software supplier that connects to customs. And we were only able to achieve a quarter of the data via that method. So it still needs some sort of manual intervention, which is why we looked in parallel as our service centre. I'm pleased to say that having gone through that exercise, we now have a service centre core team that are based in Thessalonica that we're going through the transition now where they're completing customs declarations up to 90% of what is required there. They then arrive in the UK, and the sensitive information, value, commodity code, terms of shipment and everything, is finalised in the UK and then submitted. Is that going to be the answer? No, I don't think so, but it's going to be a support mechanism that will get us in a better place if that's what ends up happening.
Okay, could I ask Dilip and Patrick, have you externalised any of this as you've gone to your ingredient suppliers or to your component suppliers? Patrick, have you started to talk outside the business about this?
Yeah, and for us, that's one of the key risks, actually. So we move probably half or thereabouts of the componentry ourselves through our managed supply chain. But a lot of the import of components into the factory is done by the suppliers themselves. So Honda isn't the importer, the exporter.
Right.
So we've carried out an exercise talking to at least the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, trying to understand, do they have expertise already in dealing with customs issues? So are they operating outside of the customs union and single market? Where they are, we can sort of check those off and say, hopefully they have some degree of understanding. Will they have to increase their capacity to to manage that. But then again, you have a group of suppliers who do not have that experience and who will have to be supported in that, whether that's by us or by government or by chambers of commerce or the FTA even. But then our supply chain is incredibly deep, so there's the risk that you could go down several levels to some company that we don't have visibility of. And as somebody was saying earlier, it only takes one fly in the ointment to bring everything grinding to a halt. And so that's where we, and I think also government, have a role to play in making sure that everybody in the supply chain understands what they will need to do to comply with customs controls going forward.
Well, we'll come back to that certainly later in the day. Deep, how Diageo looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, on a similar basis, I think our biggest challenge is going to be in Europe, because we do barely any imports in Europe. So most of our imports come via Scotland. And the imports that we do in Europe is like with a two-man business, so we really need to expand our kind of sourcing in that sense.
Right. Okay. Mark?
I'd just like to add another element there, because I think all three of us have just gone into talking about imports. It isn't just imports. We mustn't forget that we will have a requirement to do declarations for exports. And it's okay, we can do and decide what we want to do for exports, but we need our European partners to be also coming to the party, because they will need to do something to discharge whatever documentation we need to do in the UK.
Indeed, and that's definitely what we'll be picking up and looking at from an EU perspective this afternoon. Any questions? Yes, with one right at the back, please. There's a question here coming. Hello, Lisa.
Hello there. I have a question probably for Patrick and for Dip. Could you tell us, have you quantified what the fly in the ointment will cost both of your companies, the delays per day? I've seen in relation to car manufacturing, the boss of Unipart in the Mail on Sunday a couple of weeks ago said that delays at Dover would cost £1 million an hour to production lines. And then, Dip, I'd be really interested to hear a little bit more about the journey or the involved in all the components in, say, for example, a bottle of Guinness, which is made in Dublin, bottled in Belfast, I believe, and then exported through Dublin port. What are the issues there? Because we don't hear a lot from Diageo.
Lisa, could you just introduce yourself and tell us who you're representing?
I was hoping you wouldn't say that, James. It's Lisa O'Carroll from The Guardian.
Go. Okay.
To cover off the cost question, we simply don't know.
Shooting in the dark. Yeah.
Not that I can go into in an open forum.
No. And that's the issue, isn't it? It's really, and probably the same for you, Dee.
Yeah, from a supply chain perspective, I mean, with Scotch we can't do anything because we have to make and produce in Scotland. From a Bailey's perspective, at the moment we use, as I say, cream from Ireland for Ireland, but we actually produce a liquid in both Ireland and Northern Ireland and bottle in both Ireland and Northern Ireland. And there we do have choices, so we can move it to either Ireland or Belfast, and we're looking into that. On Guinness, all the liquid is made in Dublin and exported from Dublin, the kegs, but we do all the canning in Runcorn in the UK, and again we're looking at changing the supply footprint on that to mitigate any kind of costs that will occur because of this.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Look, I've already taken 5 minutes of your coffee time, so I can take one quick question. Is that from just Jonathan? Very quickly? No, just in front. just behind you. Go on, sorry. That's the first one I saw.
Hi, it's James Backhouse from Backhouse Jones. I'm just interested in the perspective. Obviously, it's important for the FTA and for you as industry and for us all, actually, to put pressure on the UK government to implement what we would regard as our priorities in terms of the outcome, smooth customs union and all the rest of it. To what extent are your counterparts in your organisation or your supply chains in Europe putting pressure on their European governments to negotiate in the same way? Because we hear a lot from Europe about our difficulties, but we hear virtually nothing in our press about their difficulties, as if they're not putting pressure in the same way. But I presume they are. So
are you leveraging your influence abroad?
Okay, so I'd like to take a response on that. So as an organisation, we have actively put ourselves in front and centre of the government, being part of the government cross-border steering group, which I'm on with James. along with the splinter group, which is covering the southern corridor. So we happen to be one of 2 logistics providers. I hope that I'm representing the logistics industry as opposed to, I mean, obviously I'm there as Kuehne+Nagel, but I'm representing it. So for that, we are sharing the outcomes of what we can share in that environment with our European counterpart. But the truth is, and that's why I referenced the exports side of it and the requirement in Europe, the truth is there's sort of, the question that I had back from our European management was, when's the next referendum? When are we going to stay in Europe? That's how it is there. We in our organisation have all of our European customs managers coming in the first week of July to really wake up and smell the coffee. Yeah?
Waking up, absolutely. And again, we'll pick that up. Any other observations from?
Obviously, in the UK, we're very linked in with the government and speak to Treasury, HMRC, and Diageo, etc. In Europe, our corporate relations, we have a person in Brussels, and she's very linked in with the Brussels guys. But in terms of country by country, I would say less so. We're talking extensively with Brussels, but less country by country.
I personify myself both our European and Westminster government relations team. So I've been having quite some conversations with various perm reps from other member states in Brussels, with the institutions, and our narrative is the same because we are a European company, and we require a solution that applies to both sides of the border, and the messages land sympathetically, but you also read the papers and see how things are proceeding.
Yeah. But you get it's the same sort of, well, you need to tell us what the answers are going to be. It's you that are leaving, if you like.
Yeah, it's in that regard. It's I think there's an appreciation of the expertise and the case studies that businesses can bring. Yeah. Particularly when you speak to perhaps the Commission or Council Task Force, who are administrators, and they really appreciate just going through step by step. This is how just-in-time works, and this is what it means, and these are the implications for suppliers on the EU side. So yeah. Definitely conversations happening, but we'll see how things pan out in a week or two's time.
Yes, indeed. Next week at the summit. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. I am going to have to draw it to a close there. Thanks. That's really good. A round of applause and appreciation for our panel, please. Thank you.